Rochester, New York.
All right, thanks, Dave. Oh my, here we go. So I am Jeremy Saucier, and I work at the Strong National Museum of Play, Rochester, New York, as Dave mentioned. Um, and I've been there for about, I think, 13 years. Um, so let's see. There we go. So what I'm going to talk about today is give you some background if you haven't heard of us, tell you a bit about who we are, what we do, kind of in the highest level, but also then talk a bit about our approach to collecting, preserving, and exhibiting the history of coin-op games, which has been, I think, as Dave mentioned, certainly a big part of what the museum has been doing in the more than a decade now. And then just kind of hopefully end up with a conversation about how people can help and continue to support what we're doing. So who are we? What do we do? Well, I can't really talk about the Strong without um, really talking about the founder of the museum and the person most responsible for the Strong is Margaret Woodbury Strong. And Margaret grew up in Rochester, New York. So when we go to when I go to Chicago or go to the West Coast and I talk to folks, they're like, "Why Rochester, New York?" And because Rochester, New York isn't necessarily the coin-op capital of the world. It's not necessarily the play capital of the world. Certainly not video games. So, but it really started with this woman who was born at the end of the 19th century. So she grew up in Rochester. She was an only child. Uh, and her family had made its fortune in the buggy whip industry. They were also early investors in Eastman Kodak. So they she grew up a very affluent family, and she spent a lot of time in her childhood alone. Right? She didn't have a lot of playmates, and so she found a lot of her play was solitary, and she did a lot of collecting. She did a lot of playing with her dolls, her doll houses. And there's a little clip, I'm not sure if you can read it, but she wrote about this later in life, saying, from the time I was 8 years old, my father and mother would take me out of school and away. We would go to foreign countries. And I was allowed to carry a small bag to put my dolls and toys in. And really anything that she acquired, she would add to that bag. So, what that's meant kind of for Margaret and what it ultimately means for the museum is she became sort of fascinated and enamored with small things, miniatures, um, small dolls, figurines, those sorts of things. Um, but eventually, she ends up amassing um, a huge collection of these sorts of things. And as an adult, she built new wings on her house. So you can see this photo to the right is actually something that she added onto her house just to house her dollhouse collection, which I think at the time of her death, she had about 500 of them. Um, and so she began actually bringing people over to her home as if it was a museum. She was sort of operating it in that way. Not anyone could go, but she sort of thought of her house as a museum at one point. And so in 1968, she goes to the New York Board of Regents and she is able to secure a charter for what at the time she called a museum of fascination. She loved that word. Now, unfortunately for Margaret, she ended up passing away in 1969. But in her will, she provided for the unencumbered transfer of her collection and her estate. Um, at the time of her death, she was reportedly the largest single shareholder of Eastman Kodak stock, um, which again is not at the time in 1968, 1969, was a lot of money. Um, but she transferred all this to a museum corporation that was then responsible for creating some kind of museum out of this collection. There's a much longer story about this, and there were some of the money went to the community and different foundations, but ultimately there was money set aside to deal specifically with the collection and to decide on a focus for museum. And so, in order to identify a direction for this collection, they brought in what you would kind of expect them to do. They brought in consultants, which at the time were historians, museum professionals, to kind of look at the collection. And at the time, many of those professionals acknowledged that Margaret had this world-class collection of toys and dolls, including something like 30,000 dolls. Um, but all of them, every single one of these consultants, they saw that children, fun, imagination, and play were sort of, reflected in Margaret's collections, but none of them could see that as a potential museum. It was the 1970s. There were a couple different things going on. One was the fact that there wasn't anything like that that existed, and those professionals at the time didn't take it seriously. It's like, how do you make a museum about imagination or play? I think the other thing going on at the time was that in the historical profession was a sort of phenomenon called the new social history. And so there was this new emphasis on everyday life, right? Looking at court records, looking at everyday material culture to understand the ways that ordinary people lived their lives rather than studying political leaders all the time, right? And so what ends up happening is that, not surprisingly, given that, those two things, um, that in 1982, we opened the museum with a focus and a mission um, that's on the impact of industrialization on everyday American life, which I can tell you as a historian, that's really interesting to me. But to most people in the public, the impact of industrialization on everyday life is not the sexiest of topics. I think the first year we got about 100,000 or a little more than 100,000 visitors, and then after that, it just went down lower and lower. Um, so when we opened in 1982, this is what the Strong looked like. It was this sort of fortress in the middle of Rochester, concrete fortress. Um, this is what some of our exhibits looked like, right? So this is a photo of how the museum dealt with leisure at the time. They didn't call it play, right? And it's a pretty static, traditional, historical, or history museum exhibit, right? You're supposed to look at things. You're supposed to, read labels, and you're supposed to reflect on what you're looking at. Maybe you talk to somebody about it, but that's pretty much it. Another thing we did was we had developed, right? So again, this is now the early 1980s. We developed what was called open storage. And so it was actually taking a lot of Margaret's collection, but again, we were also actively collecting around that mission. And we were just putting them in cases out for everyone to see. So I show this photo, it looks a little bit like an antique mall, You're looking at these dolls behind behind glass. There's actually not a lot of interpretation there, right? You're just seeing mostly the dolls themselves. People are looking, and maybe some of them are saying, oh, my grandmother had a doll like that. I remember that when I was a little girl. So just to fast forward to what we look like today and what in part I'm going to talk about. But today, right, so we opened, we're about 120,000 square feet. After our third museum expansion in 2023, which added another 90,000 square feet, we're now at 375,000 square feet. So it's the sort of campus, if you will, is about a city block. And that's not I mean, you're seeing a parking garage, but that doesn't include outdoor exhibit that we have as well. And thinking back to the exhibits that I showed you, the way that we sort of looked and talked about things in 1982, our exhibits today look a lot more like this. They're interactive, they're dynamic. Um, we think about not just looking at things and reading about them, but also creating spaces that people can play in and people can learn through play, because that's very much a part of who we are. Um, so what changed? So in the late 90s, just to give you a kind of quick, how do we get there? Our board and our CEO at the time, Raleigh Adams, just had a different vision. Raleigh went back and he looked at some of the stuff that I just shared with you, right? Went back and looked in our own museum archives and saw that, hey, from the very beginning, all these consultants saw that this was a world-class collection. All these consultants saw that children and imagination and play were these really, prevalent themes in all of the stuff that's here at the museum, but they just didn't go that route. And so at the time, they really thought the museum should have been about play from the very beginning. Now, that was not a switch. It didn't happen overnight. This took years of them doing market research. It took years of them doing study and looking at actually the field of play, right, of play studies, and really trying to understand, how could we contribute to this larger conversation about the importance of play? How could we act as a site for researchers, for people trying to preserve these materials and talk about the history and the importance of play? And so by the late 1990s, we were moving in that direction. And by about 2003, we had changed our mission and our focus to the study and exploration of play. And we built programs and and initiatives around that idea. So today, to give you a sense of that, the Strong is home to the International Center for the History of Electronic Games. That's the sort of program that we do a lot of our work related to coin-op, but also electronic games more broadly. Our National Toy Halls of Fame, which we each year, annually, I guess, we induct 2 or 3 toys into the Toy Hall of Fame, but we're also a site for the Toy Association, which is the Toy Industries Hall of Fame. We have the World Video Game Hall of Fame, which we started in 2015, which is modeled somewhat after the National Toy Hall of Fame, and we induct games into that annually as well. Our Brian Sutton Smith Library and Archives of Play. So if folks come to do research at the museum, that's often where they're going to do research. And it's named after Brian Sutton Smith. And for those who aren't familiar with him, he's really the foremost scholar of the study of play of the 20th century. And he donated his personal papers, his library to the museum. Really, really fascinating guy. A more recent initiative has been our National Archives of Game Show History. We'll be doing an exhibit specifically on the history of game shows. And so right now we're very much actively collecting around that history, including some very, very large set pieces from from a lot of game shows that you would all recognize. Um, we also have the American Journal of Play, which is something that I edit. It's a scholarly journal, but it's also written and edited in a way that a general reader um, can understand what folks are talking about, right? Um, it's coming out of a museum. It's really important to us that if I've got a journal that has a neuroscientist, an early childhood educator, and a historian publishing in the same exact journal, that those people need to be able to understand the what the other person is saying, and that's not often the case. Right? A lot of time, neuroscientists talk to other neuroscientists, right? And they write for the 50 other people who work in their area. We also have the Woodbury School, which is a play-based preschool. And so that I'll just quickly say that's a little bit of us modeling what we preach, right, in the importance of play. So as we are, as we're kind of here today, our mission, which has evolved over time today, is we study and explore play to illuminate the American experience in all its rich diversity and the broader human story. And through play, we encourage learning, nurture creativity, promote discovery, and transform the lives of people of all ages, right? So play is important to us as a history museum, but also in a unique way as a play museum, right? We want people who come to the museum in whatever way they come to hopefully have a better understanding of play and then themselves, because play is universal. We all do it. If you're here at the Pinball Expo, I don't have to I don't have to tell you that. So what does that mean in a very practical sense? Well, um, today we care for the world's most comprehensive collection of playthings. So real quick way to say this is that there are people here, I'm looking at you, Rob, who have, incredible collections of pinball machines, and we're not going to outdo Rob in terms of, that individual area, but in terms of the entire scope of play, right? It's comprehensive. Any area that you can think of, we want to represent in a way that people would be able to better understand it. So we're not necessarily going to have every single pinball machine. We're not going to necessarily have every single action figure or whatever it might be. But we strive to be the most comprehensive. And not only the playthings themselves, but also historical materials related to play. So I'll just very quickly kind of give you a quick sense of what you're looking at here. And some of this you may recognize, but in that top corner, your top, I guess, left corner, you're seeing an original Dungeons and Dragons set, which not only is an original D&D set, but it's also the provenance here is really interesting, really important. And this was a set that was um, played by a guy named Bill Hoyt, who was a contemporary of Dave Arneson, who was the co-creator of D&D. And so he played with Dave Arneson, but he was also a middle school librarian. And so this game he actually used to teach students, right? And it's funny when I say this too, because you think of all the sort of moral panics around play and the stuff that comes, that TSR and D&D players dealt with about, what was happening when you're playing D&D. And here's a guy in the 70s using Dungeons and Dragons to teach his students history, mythology, map, how to read a map. And so the green booklet up there is actually something that he put together, publishing all their stories related to their D&D play. In the middle is Thomas Edison's Talking Doll, which was a huge flop. but from a technological standpoint, it was really innovative. It's the first talking doll. In the right-hand corner is Charles Darrow's prototype for Monopoly. So this is really the first Monopoly game. Could do an entire other talk on the history of Monopoly and where that comes from, which I'm sure many of you already know that. But this is Darrow's prototype, which he um, created at his kitchen table, which is why it's round. But many of the misspellings that you see them here. You still see them today on the board. In the left bottom corner, looks like a GI Joe, but it's actually a GI Joe that was in 1993. A group of artists and activists went to toy stores. They were called the Barbie Liberation Organization, and they bought, I think, about several hundred of these Barbies and GI Joes that were out at the time, and they switched the voice boxes on them as a way to comment on gender stereotypes. And so you had, they put them back into the stores, and so you had talk with my hands. You had little girls waking up, the holidays, opening up their Barbie, and it said something like, attack. Um, and then you had, others opening up, um, the Duke here, and it said something like, math is hard. Um, so it's just a way to kind of get at like some things we have are kind of unique in that way. They look like you would never think there's anything unique about this object, but it has this really interesting provenance. Next to that is one of the very first prototypes for the video game cartridge for the Fairchild Channel F. And that was donated by the family of Jerry Lawson, who was black engineer who led the team that created that console. Next to it, so I mentioned historical materials. We'll talk more about that, but George Parker's diaries, right? So one of the founders of Parker Brothers. Next to that, not sure how many of you in here are familiar with Skylanders. It's like one of the first toys where you actually took the toy, put it on a portal using RFID technology, and it put your character right into the game. Toys for Bob, who was owned by Activision when they were sort of ending the Skylanders franchise. They called us. We went out there. We recorded interviews. We collected all that we could. And so what you're seeing there is actually it's just a Dixie bowl with some wiring, but that's the original prototype for the portal of power. And then, of course, so many of you are going to be familiar with Computer Space, right? The first commercial coin-op game. This just gives you a little more sense of the scope, right? These are just a few of our collection storage areas. We have more than 500,000 objects and countless historical materials. All right, that's great. That's sort of who we are, what we do in a nutshell. But how do we collect, preserve, and exhibit the history of coin-op games? So first, I want to really just think about our approach to collecting and preserving the history of coin-op, and then talk about exhibition after. And so the first thing you need to think about is what are some of the larger themes? You need some kind of a framework, right? What are some of the themes and the forces that are shaping this history? Although this is not a comprehensive look at this, at a higher level, it's a framework that helps us apply this sort of thinking to collecting, right? So you have the games themselves, right, which allow us to look deeply at specific games, kinds of games, trends, changes, continuity over time, what different forms and styles have sort of for coin-op, where has that gone over time? What's been popular? What hasn't been popular? Why? What are the cultural forces that have shaped these games? And how do these games kind of reflect those cultural forces? So second thing, the producers, and I mean that very broadly, right? So who makes these games? Um, who are the key designers, right? But also who develops them? Who the engineers, the manufacturers, the marketers, who sell them, right? What does that process look like? How has that changed and why? What were the key companies that have played roles in producing these games? And where do the ideas for them come from? And you have the players, right? So who plays them? Why? Um, how have players changed? Have they? Uh, what are the benefits um, of playing? A lot of play game scholars think of the idea of co-creation, right? So when you're playing that game, that you're in some ways co-creating with the person who made the game. What are their effects, right? So we don't want to trivialize these sorts of things. Um, and then there's the play itself, right? How are these games similar or different from previous forms of play? All right, pinball has its own history where it draws from other forms of play. I think some of the most fascinating games I've seen is when pinball tries to do something like, how do you make a pinball machine about basketball that isn't just artwork that looks like basketball, right? Like, look at NBA Fast Break. Really interesting. I know that's not the most popular game in the world, but really interesting the way that that translates one completely different style of play, right, into a pinball machine. Um, and then it's, I think, thinking about what does the future of play look like, and how do we look at the past to understand that. So, with all that in mind, what are we preserving? What's our approach? Well, so then maybe not surprisingly, right? We want the original games. Now, again, as I said, it's not it's comprehensive. It's not going to be, and it's representative. It's not going to be every single game ever made, but it is going to span, starting in the late 19th century all the way up to the present. Some of the games are games that they made 20,000 of, or even 50,000 of. Other ones are going to be games that they made one or two. So you can see next to World's Fair down there, Maze Invaders, which was a prototype game that they made two of. Went out on test, didn't do well. When we get game design students who come to the museum, I always love to show them that game because I say, hey, Ed Logg created Asteroids, co-created Centipede. Yeah, he also did Maze Invaders. Um, so, we can all make turkeys. Um, but yeah, so really thinking Japanese games, new and old, and again, that also allows us to look at and think about how some of this play ends up evolving over time. So just as a quick aside here, so how do you, if you're doing that work, if you're going, okay, we're gonna collect all these games to preserve them, what are acceptable preservation techniques for games in a setting like this, right? And so what we did was we drew from and kind of developed in two different areas, and the first is historic preservation. And what I mean there is we're talking about a historic home, right? So when you go into a historic home, whoever worked on that house made decisions about what things they were going to change, what things they were going to leave. Because even the case of Mount Vernon, which was one of the very first kind of um, historic homes in the United States, right? They needed to make these decisions because other people often change things over time. We've all seen this in all the arcade games that we get, right? Like, oh, the cigarette burns. Okay, well, that shows use. Do you get rid of the cigarette burns, to make it look pristine, or do you keep that there because people put their cigarettes there when they were playing? Right? So it's stuff like that every one of those things is a conversation. It doesn't mean we're going to go, hey, that doesn't, we don't need to have that. Let's change that. Um, it means that it's going to be a conversation about, okay, well, a pinball, it's an expendable, right? But the ramp, like the original ramp that's in that game, if we replace that with a new old stock ramp or something else, then we're going to save that original ramp, right? It's a historic preservation. It's a museum conservation approach, right? You want to do the least amount of harm you can to the artifact, and you want to make it reversible, right? So that's a lot. That's sort of where we're coming from there, and we started to treat these things as what we called usefacts, and our where this kind of came from for us was that the first usefact we really had in the collection was this carousel. And we realized, hey, this is an artifact, but we're letting people use it. We're letting people play it. But we have to maintain it in a way that keeps it going while also treating it like an artifact. And so a lot of the techniques then that we developed over time for coin op really started with this carousel that we worked on. So you can see Martin, who's in the audience here. He's our lead arcade conservation tech, and so I mean he's fantastic. And we have a full-time museum conservator as well on staff. And so they work together with other folks on staff to keep the games um, running, to prepare them for researchers, and to have to again maintain them in a way that makes sense for the museum. And I wanted to point out, I put a photo here of flippers just to point out, right? Like a lot of people are using 3D printing now, and one of the really interesting things for us, just as a side story here, is we had a Flintstones pinball game, and if many of you are probably familiar with this game, but Ice built it, and they used Bam Bams. They switch the flippers around, which there's a reason why the flippers are shaped the way they are, right? So um, cool idea, but in reality, the flippers break. And when we acquired the game, the thing had been like cobbled together. It looked like Frankenstein flipper. And we went out to ICE, who's outside of Buffalo, so not far from us, and we talked to them, and they're like, "Do you have any more of these flippers? Nope. Do you have the original molds, the drawings?" Nope, nope. And so we went down this path of, okay, well, we got to make our own. And the really interesting thing about that too is just being in Rochester at the Rochester Institute for Technology. There's the Image Permanence Institute, and so Martin and our conservator Gabe have been working with that institute too to better understand how long do these 3D prints work, and how well do they work? What sort of what can we expect in the future? So thinking about other things here. So our approach is, okay, the games themselves, but there's, right, we're thinking the games, the players, the producers, right, the play. So there's other materials that we want to think about. And some of the most important are archival materials, right? And so a lot of times these are personal papers, or they're company papers, documentation, right? So you could just see a couple of examples of, and these are just little snippet photographs of much larger collections. One from Ken Fidesna, the other from the family of Ralph Coppola, who is one of the co-founders of ICE, and then Ken Fidesna, who many of you probably know, but was an executive at Williams, and then Williams, Midway, Bally, Atari at the very end there. But so you're collecting materials, in this case, things that give us some insight into the thinking at the highest level, right? So they could be papers from executives who are making decisions about what actually gets made, strategies for the company, strategies for the business, what's happening in the industry, how's it changing, right? A lot of that stuff's happening, and it's showing up in this type of documentation. but it's other kinds of documentation as well, right? So worked with the family of, thanks to Roger Sharp, worked with the family of Steve Epstein to collect a group of materials from his work as one of the co-founders of Papa, but also uh, as the owner and operator of Broadway Arcade. He even has game design materials in his collection. But and Steve's is a great example too of one of the areas I think is the least well documented. Actually, I think I see Justin here, but last night one of the movies showing here, but last night um, the movie here last night dealing with the history of the arcade uh, does a great job at showing an area that I think is very underdocumented and very undertold, which is the history of the operator and the arcade owner, right? The people who actually, put these games out and operated them. So Steve's, I hope, is like a first step for us in that way, but also includes stuff like the Carol Cantor papers. Right? So this was a woman who Atari hired fairly early on, the mid 70s, and she came in and created the first market and user research group at Atari. This was really the first time that anybody in the video game industry was using market research. And so they developed all sorts of different techniques, including using things that today we just sort of take for granted with products like focus groups, but they really weren't doing things like that, and particularly in the coin op industry. But it's also a nice way of also highlighting one of our initiatives is Women in Games. And so Carol's papers add to that, right? We want to show that women have been making games, since really the beginning of time, right? Monopoly actually comes from a woman who created an earlier game called the Landlord's Game. Um, some of the most popular games of the 19th century, Authors, Dr. Busby, were created by women. So women have been making games for centuries, and so their contributions haven't always been shown. And so that's a key part of our work. And Carol becomes particularly important in kind of establishing some of the way that the industry studies players, which is another way for us to get at the player's role. But then, as I said, there's key companies, right? So there are, so at the museum, and again, these are sort of snapshots of this stuff, but we have Bally Midway Williams records going back to the beginning of those companies, and then the Atari Coin Op Division records, which you're looking at stuff up there like original design drawings from Ed Log for the rocks, the asteroids in Asteroids, right? Those are his original hand drawings, right? Photographs from the company that they used for marketing purposes. And these are great resources too, because again, a lot of times you're not necessarily seeing the manufacturing process in that way. Like Jim has done some of that work where he's photographed when they allowed him to actually go into the factories and photograph. And that, again, it's just one of those things that there's just not a lot of that documentation, right? There aren't people standing around all the time like taking pictures of people soldering. It just isn't just isn't happening. But that's the labor that also helped build these industries. But you see up in the right hand corner, that's market research focus group testing for Centipede. And then to the left, it's industrial design documentation. So really all the things that you can think of as part of the process of making these games, and from concept to actually having them in the hands of the player, that's what we're interested in. Now, in addition to this, there's published materials, and that's right. Everything that you can think of that's published out there, right? We keep in our library. And that's sometimes that's coming to us in a collection from an individual donor like Larry Biza, who's if you're not familiar with him, he's really fantastic collector of early coin-op paper. And so he's donated a lot of materials to the museum that are published, but also some things that are unique in the sense that there wasn't a lot of these kinds of, like, again, you're getting photos and sales book images from Exhibit Supply Company and International Mutascope, some of these really early 20th century, coin-op giants. But we're also collecting the flyers, the marketing materials, the magazines, right? Going back for more than a century, right? All of this stuff um, has really helped to kind of fuel the growth of the collection. And I just want to give you just want to show you just a quick sort of sense again of scope. A couple of images from our library and our archives. So they're closed stacks, right? So if any of you were to come, Justin knows this because he's been here. It's you sort of come and you're requesting stuff, and it's brought out to you. It's so you don't get to walk through these stacks necessarily, pulling out whatever you want, but we work with really everybody to make the materials as accessible as we can. And then just the last approach I want to talk about really quickly is migration and digitization. And so the first thing I want to say is that migration and digitization is an approach to preservation. It is not preservation. And I say that because a lot of people, I get this question all the time where it's like, well, why don't you just post it on the internet and that'll save it forever? And that's not preservation. Like, it's great that, if you want to post something on the internet, awesome. But I have to imagine that if, you see the copy of the Declaration of Independence on the internet, you're probably not, you're probably still thinking, hey, I hope somebody actually has the original somewhere and they're taking care of it. It's a different thing. So I want to say that, but and this means, and I mean this again very broadly, right? So we get materials that are everything from papers from the 19th century up to things that are purely digital, or they're on 8-inch floppy disks, right? Or smaller floppy disks, right? Sometimes they come on servers, right? And so you can see in our corner there, it's a picture of our director of digital preservation, Andrew Borman. But so we have what we've done in this area, without going into excruciating detail, is we've really developed a system for prioritizing this stuff, and it's called RAVE, as an acronym: rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging. And so when we look at things that we're like, okay, you're basically triaging, right? When you come into the emergency room, it's like, okay, do you have a broken arm or are you dying? And so we look at these things. Is it rare, right? Is this the only copy of something that exists, right? Are these, like we have we have design documentation from Bruce Shelley from Age of Empires, where, I mean, it's his documentation. It's all this digital documentation. Nobody else had this. So certainly fits that criteria. Is it at risk, right? Is it on a form of media that we're afraid is going to, degrade and disappear? Is it valuable? Doesn't necessarily mean monetarily, but has historical value. And is it engaging, right? Will it maybe sooner or later have potential for exhibition? And I want to point out that all these things that I'm talking about, right, they have made this sort of work possible. And these are just books, right? Mentioning the documentaries and other things. But these are a sample of just some of the publications, not including articles, all these other things, from scholars who have come to this strong, researchers who have come to this strong, and done that work, and looked at materials that we have, right? Because we don't just collect this stuff to collect it. We want to make it accessible in ways that we are able to and that are appropriate, so that people can do this work. Now I'm going to quickly go through our exhibits. Just a sort of quick, give you a sense of our approach and kind of the history of that there. So our approach is what we refer to as it's a kind of three-legged stool, right? It's artifacts, interpretation, interactive. This combination of looking, learning, and playing. Of course, we see learning and playing as synonymous, right? That you learn through play as well. But really, that's the magic combination for us. Sometimes there's a little bit more emphasis in one area or the other, but it's not all play. When it becomes all play, to a lot of people, it looks a lot like a children's museum. Um, so we sort of sit in this kind of unique position where sometimes to people we look like a children's museum, sometimes we look like a history museum, sometimes a science museum, you know, because we're talking about this massive subject that we all do. So quickly again, how have we explored the history of coin-op games? I'll give you a kind of quick run through of how we've done this. Starts in 2009 with Videotopia, which was a traveling exhibit. Brought this to the museum. You remember it's 2009, so this is in right in that time where we've moved to the play mission. She's starting to really look at the history of gaming, and this actually was a great way to help our board members and some of the museum staff at the time understand the potential for collecting and doing exhibits on video games and other games, but also using coin-op games. Um, so in 2011, we created our first permanent exhibit about the history of video games called E-Game Revolution. And this began as a transformation of the museum's second floor. So you can see a photo of that's, you know, China. So it's again, like you saw the doll picture, it was that open storage concept. So it went from, you know, you'd walk through looking at, you know, dishes to seeing and playing through the history of electronic games. And we saw that, in particular, the coin-operated games were popular with guests. So that led us down some other paths. In 2013, we opened up Boardwalk Arcade and Atari by Design, which were temporary exhibits. Several of these will be looking at the history of coin-op in a sort of boardwalk context. And then taking some of these collections, right, because the collections are feeding, right, the exhibitions that we do, and doing an exhibit on the design of Atari's coin-op games. 2014, we opened up a temporary exhibit called Pinball Playfields. This was our first time then now showcasing our rapidly growing pinball collection, and then the materials that we were collecting related to pinball, which then a year later, right, that was so successful that we actually transformed what was previously a gift shop in the museum, a retail space, into a permanent exhibit on the history of pinball. Um, and you know, in addition to taking kind of a deeper dive into design, we also wanted to explore some broader cultural themes like moral panics. Um, you know, it's again another great example of also us then using coin-op games, using these sorts of games also to expand our adult audience. Couple other exhibits that we did, Rockets, Robots, and Ray Guns, and Have a Ball, right? And the reason I show these is that we incorporated video games and coin-op into larger discussions of play and broader thematic exhibits, right? So now we're going, hey, we're doing exhibits about, you know, the history of science fiction play, but you know, there's a lot of coin-op games that deal with that, right? And so really kind of leaning into using those collections and having these broader conversations. We did an exhibit in 2015 on the anniversary of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which will set us up for something later, but also, again, looking at Nintendo's contributions to the history of coin-op was a big part of that exhibit as well. It's what leads them into consoles as well. So I mentioned our Women in Games initiative. We did an exhibit. Also did an exhibit which we still have up or not, don't still have it up, but have done a newer rendition of it. It's focused on the history of coin-op racing games. And then in 2023, as part of this larger museum expansion, 90,000 square foot, we opened up the centerpiece, which was our Digital Worlds exhibit. And again, what you're seeing here, it became a home for our World Video Game Hall of Fame. You can actually see, Chuck Blake, Larry DeMar, Ray Gay, Sam Dicker, Eugene Jarvis, Paul Dassault. So most of the Defender team at the museum when Defender was inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame. But it became a home for our Women in Games initiative. And just, again, to point out that, the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing the start of what's about a 88-foot timeline of the history of electronic games. And we want to show that a lot of that history starts not just with computing and analog computing, but also with the coin-op industry. Level Up, which is sort of the sister exhibit to High Score. The reason I want to mention this, it's sort of a first-person view of the history of electronic games, and you kind of go into the games, kind of playing through these different mechanics. But there's also a lot of stuff in there that is inspired by coin-op. I could do a whole other talk on what the museum field could learn from the history of coin-op and from the people who made these games. Nintendo leads us to when we opened in 2023, we created the world's largest Donkey Kong, and we worked closely with Nintendo. And again, we built that relationship with them previously. And it's sort of it sort of speaks for itself. You gotta play it at some point. And then most recently in 2024, we opened Infinity Arcade. We went back to eGame Revolution. We said, hey, we've done this. We've created about 25,000 square feet dedicated to the history of electronic games. So let's go back, and now let's lean into doing an exhibit that specifically focuses on the history of coin-op. And so you can see that we're dealing with stuff from the early 20th century up to the present, but then also talking through and looking at how these games were made. What are some of those cultural forces? So I'm going to end by saying, how can you help? Well, preservation develops through conversations, right? We're always talking to people, right? The scholars who come to the museum, we learn from them as much as they learn, right? We're always talking to them because what is it that we don't have? Sometimes they have connections to people that because they've interviewed them or they've talked to them, that the collections come in that way. Right? You're thinking about collectors, right? Collectors play an extraordinarily important role, right? Because people who are collectors almost every time see the value of something before anybody else, right? The whole history of art museums, that's the entire history. Somebody identifies an artist and falls in love with them well before any curator at a museum cares about it. And so collectors play an extremely important role in that, along with these producers, consumers, as we've talked about, and then technology, right? Because technology continues to change both in the way that we preserve the games, but also in the way that they're made. So we continue to do that work. I think I am like right at the end of my time here, but thank you for your attention. I don't know if there's any time for any questions. Okay.
I'm going to start. Uh, I'm a person who first met Carol Cantor when she gave a focus group for Atari back in the MOA show in 1976. So I can say she is a historic figure. Do you have anything coming up in the next couple of years? Like we should make sure to reserve a trip at a certain time of a year or whatever, something in the works to dangle before us?
Yeah, so good question. So really the next couple of years, so coming out of the expansion in 2023, we've had several opportunities to, and some of them are related to the fact that, there's just some exhibits that were like, okay, they're a little long in the tooth, we've got to turn our attention back to them. But I would say that probably the biggest one will be the History of Game Shows exhibit. And that's what, again, our work, every conversation that I'm a part of, I'm drawing on my knowledge of the history of coin op in those conversations where we even talk about game shows, right? Because when we look at even creating interactives to help people understand a particular history of play, um, you need to create these in ways that people are going to get it immediately, right? That they're going to learn something from it, and that they're going to enjoy it. And really, there's nobody does that any better than the coin op game industry. So that's an exhibit that will right now we're looking at probably 2027.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that'll probably be our next biggest exhibit, and it'll include things like the original wheel from Wheel of Fortune.
Okay, there's a pinball connection.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. What percentage of the collection is on display to the public?
So, are you talking about coin op in particular?
No, I'm talking about the entire museum. I know you talked about your visual storage, which is a great
Yeah,
idea, but what percentage of the total collection is on display?
I'd say a small percentage. I don't have the exact. We have over 500,000 objects in the collection, right? So if you think of, right now we have a temporary exhibit called Dollhouses Unveiled, and a lot of Margaret's original dollhouses are out on display. That also means the little dollhouse furniture that's in there, right? So it's extremely labor intensive from a conservation standpoint. So I would say a small percentage, but we more so than I would say any other. I mean, worked in this field for a while now, more so than almost any other museum that I've been to or have been involved in. We do exhibits. I mean, we're doing multiple exhibits a year, new exhibits. So we are constantly getting materials, objects out, even if they're in temporary exhibits, or we will update earlier exhibits. But yeah, I mean, overall, most museums, it's a fraction of your entire collection is on display at any time.
Hello, Jeremy. Uh, I do a lot of research both in video games and coin op, and I'm kind of curious in terms of lately, what has been kind of the split in terms of people who come in for research to do it on video games versus electromechanical, mechanical coin op versus play versus something like game shows.
Yeah, so I would say the vast majority of people who are coming to do research today um, are interested in video games, but that is not um, the thing about that is that in order to understand the history of video games, they need to look at the history of board games. They need to look at the history of earlier mechanical and electromechanical games, right? And so you can have somebody who comes in and says, hey, I want to look at, the representations of indigenous people in video games. And they may not even have thought of that. And we would talk with them and say, there's a lot of board games, there's a lot of coin op stuff that feeds into that, right? So I would say that's the area of the biggest growth in terms of scholarly interest. That's where a lot of the books are being published as well. But there's also a lot of people who are looking at, well, where did they come from, right? And so more and more people are doing that work as well.
Last call for questions.
Up front
Oh,
here.
Jim. There.
You have some artifacts that uh, show the development of games, such as blueprints and drawings and things. What are some of the games? What are some of the pinball machines for which you have those kind of artifacts?
Um, yeah, too many to mention. I mean, several years ago, we worked with Duncan Brown and WMS or Scientific Games, to preserve an entire collection of the original playfield drawings for Williams games, starting with I think the second game up through the 90s, while some of the designers were still doing it the old-fashioned way rather than just using CAD. So I mean, it's virtually all the games, just as an example. But I mean, so many Atari games, um, Williams, Bally, Midway, but it depends on the game, right? There's some areas where it's like you have almost everything to show like a process, and then in other ways you would kind of have to go, well, I can show you this for Space Invaders, I can show you this for asteroids, or I can show and it can sort of fill out the process. Um, but I mean, it's too many to mention. Honestly, it's a ton of stuff. Yeah.
All right, last question here.
Is there any remote access to the archival information that you've got?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, when we bring in three-dimensional objects into the museum, they're all photographed and cataloged, and that those objects are, as part of our process, are then put online through our online database on the museum's website. Archival materials are a little bit different in the sense that one, again, as we talked about our priorities, um, it'll sort of depend, because it could be that there are restrictions on the materials, so we can't necessarily make them available remotely in the sense of like, oh, let's put it somewhere and then you can access it. We may be able to make you copies of things, digital copies that are appropriate, but it depends on the collection, right? So like the Williams, the playfield drawings, they were very adamant about the fact that they didn't want those just posted online or made available in that way. And so sometimes we try to put the least amount of restrictions as we can, but sometimes you're dealing with legal things, and sometimes you're dealing with the wishes of a donor. So, but we try to make them as accessible as possible. Obviously, the easiest thing is going to be coming, but you can make research requests for materials online at our website.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.